Once upon a time, in a quiet and wealthy neighborhood, there stood a massive, beautiful mansion. It belonged to a man named Raghav, a multimillionaire who had achieved immense success in the business world. From the outside, his life looked absolutely perfect. He had wealth, power, status, and a beautiful home. However, inside the grand mansion, there was nothing but a crushing, silent emptiness. A few years prior, Raghav had tragically lost his wife and his only child in a terrible accident. Since that day, his heart had turned to stone. The massive house, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, felt less like a home and more like a beautifully decorated tomb. Raghav threw himself entirely into his work, leaving early in the morning and returning late at night, barely looking at the empty rooms around him. He felt entirely detached from the world, convinced that he would spend the rest of his life completely alone. Because Raghav was rarely home and disliked dealing with the daily maintenance of such a massive property, he decided to hire a distant relative to look after the place. This relative, an opportunistic and cold-hearted man named Madhav, was given full authority to manage the mansion, hire staff, and ensure everything remained in perfect order. Raghav didn't care about the details. He simply paid Madhav a generous sum every month and trusted him to handle the rest. What Raghav did not know was that Madhav was using the mansion for his own financial gain, cutting corners on maintenance, pocketing the extra money, and treating anyone who worked there with utter cruelty. One chilly evening, a young woman named Mira arrived at the back gates of the mansion. Mira was a widow, having lost her husband to a sudden illness just a year ago. She was left entirely alone in the world with two very young children, a bright 6-year-old boy named Arav and a sweet 4-year-old girl named Chavi. Desperate, homeless, and without a single penny to her name, Mira had wandered from place to place looking for any kind of employment. When she begged Madhav for a job, he saw an opportunity to exploit her. He offered her a position as a live-in maid, but under horrific conditions. He refused to pay her an actual salary, offering her instead a tiny, damp servant's quarter at the very back of the estate and a few scraps of leftover food each day. With no other choice and 2 starving children to feed, Mira wept tears of gratitude and accepted the harsh terms. For months, Mira worked tirelessly from dawn until late into the night. She cleaned the massive hallways, dusted the expensive artifacts, washed the heavy linens, and kept the mansion spotless. Her days were filled with exhausting physical labor, and her nights were spent comforting her children in their cold, cramped room. Arav and Shavi were remarkably well-behaved children. They understood their mother's pain and tried their best to remain completely silent, hiding in the shadows whenever they heard footsteps. Madhav strictly warned Mira that if the owner, Raghav, ever saw or heard the children, she would be thrown out onto the streets immediately. Fearful for her children's safety, Mira kept them hidden away, teaching them to play quietly and never to venture into the main areas of the mansion. As time passed, the mansion began to feel alive, though Raghav remained entirely unaware of it. While he sat in his lonely study upstairs, staring blankly at financial reports, a few floors below, a mother was gently putting her children to sleep with bedtime stories of hope and kindness. Mira possessed a rare grace and an unwavering spirit of humanity. Despite her own suffering and the cruelty she faced daily from Madhav, she never allowed bitterness to enter her heart. She taught Arav and Shavi to always be kind, to pray for those who were suffering, and to respect the home that provided them with a roof over their heads. One afternoon, Raghav returned home much earlier than usual. A business meeting had been cancelled, and he felt an overwhelming wave of exhaustion. As he stepped through the heavy front doors, the mansion was unusually quiet. He walked across the polished marble floor and decided to sit in the main living room, a space he rarely ever used. He leaned his head back against the sofa, closing his eyes, letting the heavy silence wrap around him. A few moments later, Mira entered the living room carrying a bucket and a cleaning cloth, entirely unaware that Raghav was home. When she saw him sitting there, she froze in absolute terror. Her heart raced, and she immediately dropped to her knees, bowing her head in a panic. She began to apologize profusely, begging him not to fire her or throw her children out. Raghav opened his eyes, startled by the sudden voice. He looked down to see a woman in a simple, worn-out white sari, trembling with fear and crying uncontrollably. Before Raghav could even ask who she was or what was happening, the sound of tiny footsteps echoed down the hallway. Arav and Chavi, wondering why their mother had been gone for so long, had wandered out of the servants' quarters. Seeing their mother on her knees in tears before a strange man, the two children rushed forward. Chavi threw her small arms around Miro, crying loudly, while Arav stood bravely in front of his mother, looking up at Raghav with a mixture of fear and defiance, trying to protect his family. Raghav stared at the scene in utter shock. For years, no one had shed a tear in this house, and no child had ever set foot in it since his own son's passing. He looked at Miro, who was now weeping openly, holding her children close to her chest. Raghav's voice, usually cold and distant, softened slightly as he asked her to stand up and explain who she was. Trembling, Miro revealed everything: how she was a widow, how Madhav had hired her without a salary just for a place to sleep, and how she had kept her children hidden away for months at a fair. As Raghav listened to her story, something inside his frozen heart began to crack. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of anger, not at Miro, but at the cruelty of his relative Madhav, who had exploited a desperate mother right under his own roof. He looked at the two innocent children, whose eyes were wide with fear, and suddenly, he didn't see strangers. He saw human beings who were suffering, just as he had been suffering in a different way. He told Mira to wipe her tears and assured her that no one was going to throw her out. The very next morning, Raghav called Madhav to the mansion. In a calm but terrifyingly firm voice, Raghav confronted him about his greed and cruelty. Madhav tried to lie and make excuses, but Raghav would hear none of it. He stripped Madhav of all his authority, severed all ties with him, and banished him from the estate permanently. With Madhav gone, Raghav turned his attention to Mira and her children. He called Mira into his study, but this time, the atmosphere was entirely different. He informed her that she was no longer a servant working for scraps. He assigned her a proper, comfortable room inside the main mansion for her and her children. He insisted on paying her a generous monthly salary, ensuring that she would never have to worry about food or basic necessities again. Mira was overwhelmed with gratitude, unable to believe that her life could change so dramatically overnight. However, the physical changes in the mansion were only the beginning of a much deeper transformation. The silence that had plagued the grand house for years began to shatter, replaced by the gentle, innocent sounds of children's laughter. Initially, Arav and Shavi were terrified of Raghav, viewing him as a strict and powerful figure. But Raghav, driven by a newfound sense of purpose, began to make an effort. He started buying toys, books, and beautiful clothes for the children. He would leave these gifts in the living room, watching from a distance as the children discovered them with pure joy. One evening, Raghav was sitting at the dining table, eating his dinner in his usual solitude. He looked up and saw Chavi standing by the doorway, peeking at him with curiosity. Instead of ignoring her, Raghav smiled gently and gestured for her to come closer. Hesitantly, the little girl walked over. Raghav offered her a piece of sweet fruit from his plate. Chavi took it, smiled brightly, and sat on the chair next to him. Soon, Arav joined them, and for the first time in years, Raghav did not eat alone. As the weeks turned into months, a beautiful bond formed between the lonely millionaire and the fatherless children. Raghav took it upon himself to enroll Arav and Shavi in the best school in the city. He would sit with them in the evenings, helping them with their homework, teaching them games, and listening to their endless stories about their day. In giving these children a father figure, Raghav found that his own grief was finally beginning to heal. The empty rooms of his mansion were now filled with the warmth of a real family. The society around them, however, was not as accepting. People in the wealthy neighborhood began to gossip about Raghav's living arrangements. They questioned why a multimillionaire was keeping a poor widow and her children in his home, raising eyebrows and spreading malicious rumors. One day, a close business associate visited Raghav and subtly brought up the gossip, suggesting that Raghav should send the family away to protect his reputation and status in society. Raghav listened quietly, then looked out the window to see Arav and Shavi playing in the garden, with Mira watching over them with a peaceful smile. Raghav turned to his associate and said, "When I had all the wealth in the world and a broken heart, this society offered me nothing but empty condolences. It was humanity and the innocent love of these children that brought me back to life. If society chooses to point fingers at kindness, then I care nothing for society." From that day forward, Raghav stopped caring about what the world thought. He formally adopted Arav and Shavi, giving them his name, his protection, and his immense fortune. He looked at Mira not as a worker, but as the pillar of strength who had brought light back into his dark world. Miro, through her pure heart and resilience, had transformed a lonely, wealthy man's mansion into a sanctuary of love. Years later, the mansion was no longer known as the cold, quiet estate of a lonely millionaire. It was known as a home filled with joy, laughter, and unconditional love. Raghav had saved a widow and her children from a life of misery and poverty, but in doing so, he realized a profound truth: by saving them, he had ultimately saved himself. Humanity had triumphed over loneliness, proving that the greatest wealth one can possess is not found in a bank account, but in the love shared within a family. As the years passed, the grand mansion truly became a home filled with warmth and life. Arav and Shahavi grew into bright, confident teenagers, deeply aware of the blessing they had received in Raghav, whom they now deeply loved and called their father. Miro, once a broken widow hiding in the dark servant quarters, had become the respected matriarch of the household. She managed the entire estate with grace, ensuring that the wealth they enjoyed was shared generously with those in need. Raghav's frozen heart had completely thawed. He was no longer the cold, distant businessman but a man whose face readily broke into a warm smile whenever his family was near. However, life has a way of testing the strength of the foundations people build. When Arav turned 18 and Shahavi was 16, Raghav's health began to decline. Years of early career stress and the emotional toll of his past losses finally caught up with him. He began experiencing severe fatigue and chest pains, eventually forcing him to step back from the daily operations of his multi-millionaire business empire. With Raghav temporarily weakened, old shadows began to re-emerge. Madhav, the greedy relative Raghav had cast away years ago, had never forgotten the humiliation of being banished. He had spent the last decade watching from afar, filled with intense jealousy and bitterness as he saw a poor widow's children inheriting the immense fortune he believed belonged to his side of the family. Sensing Raghav's physical vulnerability, Madhav decided it was time to strike. He joined forces with a corrupt lawyer and began fabricating legal documents, challenging Raghav's formal adoption of Arav and Shahavi, claiming that the paperwork was filed under false pretenses and that a poor, uneducated woman like Mira had manipulated an emotionally fragile Raghav. One morning, a legal notice arrived at the mansion, throwing the household into a sudden panic. The document demanded that Arav and Shahavi's adoption be nullified and accused Mira of fraud. Seeing the notice, Raghav's blood boiled with anger, but the emotional shock caused his health to take a severe turn for the worse. He collapsed in his study and had to be rushed to the hospital in critical condition. With Raghav confined to a hospital bed on life support, the mansion suddenly felt vulnerable again. Madhav arrived at the gates with a group of hired guards and legal representatives, demanding entry and claiming he was now the rightful temporary custodian of the estate while Raghav was incapacitated. He stood in the grand living room, the very place where he had once tormented Miro, and looked at her with a malicious grin. He told her that her days of pretending to be royalty were over and ordered her and her children to pack their bags and leave by sunset. 10 years ago, Miro would have dropped to her knees, wept, and begged for mercy. But she was no longer that helpless woman. Looking at Madhav, she stood tall, her eyes fierce with the protective instinct of a mother and the dignity of a woman who knew she belonged there. She refused to back down, stating firmly that until Raghav himself spoke, no one had the right to touch a single stone of the house. Arav stood right beside his mother, stepping in front of Madhav with a maturity that far exceeded his 18 years, warning him that any attempt to force them out would face immediate legal and physical resistance. While the confrontation escalated at the mansion, Shahavi remained by Raghav's side at the hospital. She held his frail hand, tears streaming down her face, whispering words of encouragement, reminding him of how he had saved them and begging him not to leave them alone in a world that was trying to tear their family apart. Back at the estate, Madhav's lawyers tried to intimidate Mira with forged documents, threatening police action. Knowing that a prolonged legal battle could drain them and destroy Raghav's reputation, Mira did something unexpected. She remembered that years ago, when Raghav had first dismissed Madhav, Raghav had kept a private safe in his study containing Madhav's original financial logs, which proved Madhav had been embezzling millions from the estate. Raghav had kept them out of a lingering sense of family mercy, choosing banishment over jail time for his relative. Leaving Arav to hold the line downstairs, Mira rushed upstairs to Raghav's study. She located the hidden safe behind a painting of Raghav's late first family. After a few tense minutes of trying combinations based on dates Raghav held dear, the safe clicked open. Inside, wrapped in a dusty folder, were the concrete, undeniable proofs of Madhav's past crimes, signed and stamped, along with the original, ironclad adoption deeds that Raghav had secured through the highest courts in the country. Meera walked down the grand staircase, holding the folder tightly. She stepped into the living room, where Madhav was getting increasingly aggressive with Arav. With absolute calm, Meera laid the documents on the table in front of Madhav and his corrupt lawyers. She told Madhav that if he did not leave the property within 5 minutes and drop all fraudulent lawsuits, she would personally hand these files over to the federal police, ensuring he spent the rest of his life behind bars for grand theft and corporate fraud. The corrupt lawyers took one look at the authentic, devastating evidence and immediately advised Madhav to retreat. Madhav's face turned pale, his grand scheme had collapsed in an instant under the weight of his own past sins. Realizing he had completely lost, he cursed under his breath, turned around, and hurried out of the mansion, never to return again. Just as the gates closed behind Madhav, Meera's phone rang. It was Jahavi from the hospital, crying, but this time, they were tears of pure joy. Raghav had regained consciousness, his vitals had stabilized, and the doctors were calling it a miraculous recovery driven by a strong will to live. Meera and Arav rushed to the hospital, and the moment they entered the room, Raghav opened his eyes and reached out his arms to them. He had heard about the legal threat before losing consciousness, but Meera smiled gently, held his hand, and whispered that everything was taken care of. For the first time, it wasn't Raghav saving Meera, it was Meera and her children protecting the home and the man who had given them everything. A few weeks later, Raghav returned home, healthier and happier than ever. The attempt to break their family had only made their bond unbreakable. Raghav officially handed over the operations of his business empire to Arav, who had proven his courage and intellect, while Jahavi decided to pursue studies in law to ensure they could always protect the vulnerable, just as they had been protected. The mansion stood grand and beautiful, a symbol